Today on the Dig In podcast, we're joined by Dr. Chen, an Old Testament scholar and an author of the Messianic vision of the Pentateuch. We're digging into what Hebrew manuscripts can teach us today and how they preserve the Old Testament's witness to the Messiah, and why the structure and design of these ancient texts still matter for the church right now. So let's dig in with Dr. Chen. Welcome back to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and we got an amazing special guest with us today, Dr. Chen. Thank you so much for joining us and taking your time to be with us today.
Thank you, Pastor Johnny. I'm so glad to be on with you and your listeners.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure. So before we get started and talking about some of the manuscripts that I can't wait to ask you a whole bunch of questions on, tell us a little bit about your background in regards to, were you raised in a Christian home? And how did your journey with Scripture, God, how did that begin? And why even turn to this part to dedicate your life to?
Yeah, my mother was the first person in my immediate family to become a believer. And that happened when I was in elementary school, in the first few years of elementary school. My parents had come to the United States for graduate school to the Chicago area, and they were not believers at that time. But after they moved to California for work, my mom, who was a nurse at the time, she was someone shared the gospel with her, and she became a believer. And so that's how kind of the faith journey for my whole family began.
Wow.
At first, for me, it looked more like being dragged to church by my mother. But by God's grace, I myself became a believer after a few years. In sixth grade, I was baptized at that time.
Nice.
So yeah, there's been a lot that happened since then, but that's how I came to faith.
Oh, that's great. All right, so let's jump into the manual. I mean, I'm sorry, just going back here. This is why evangelize, sharing the good news of the gospel, right? Evangelizing, you never know, but one person that you impact for the gospel, what effect that has from generations and generations.
Yeah, totally.
Amazing. All right, so let's talk about the manuscripts, the Hebrew manuscripts. Let's just start. Explain to our listeners, when we talk about the Hebrew manuscripts, what are we talking about? And honestly, and why should modern Christians even care about those?
Yeah. Well, Hebrew manuscripts refer to handwritten copies of the Old Testament. And they are not always complete copies of the Old Testament. Probably a lot of us have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Sure.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are a major find as it relates to Hebrew manuscripts. Some of those manuscripts are biblical. That is, they're Hebrew handwritten texts of portions of the Old Testament or of entire Old Testament books in the case of Isaiah. And some of them are written texts that are not biblical texts, that were just, they related to that community that lived at Qumran. And there's scholars that, research and sometimes make educated guesses based on what kind of community that was,
Right.
because they were living in that location too. But Hebrew manuscripts are very important to Christians and also to Jewish people also,
Sure.
as they represent the earliest written texts of Scripture.
Right.
And our translations of the Bible, whether into English or other modern languages, they're all based off of Hebrew manuscripts in the case of the Old Testament.
Gotcha. Why do we have, I guess, fragments and not whole books like that? Is it just because they were destroyed, or were they ripped apart, or they just kind of, is that how they wrote them in parts?
Yeah, the main reason just relates to archaeological or ancient historical evidence in general.
Okay.
So whether you're there's just not all of it gets preserved or not all of it lasts. It's just when you're talking about anything, whether it's a Hebrew manuscript of the Bible or let's just still say we're talking about Qumran and the Dead Sea, like one of their other manuscripts that was talking about their community life. Um, without some kind of special circumstance, those manuscripts don't last for
Mm,
2,000 years. They just,
yeah.
they decay. But what's so special about Qumran and the Dead Sea is that the conditions in the caves and the pots and stuff like that were just perfect for preserving those Hebrew manuscripts for all this time. But um, most that also means is that most ancient manuscripts, biblical or otherwise, they're just lost to time and to
Mm.
decay. They're not necessarily destroyed. There's probably a small number of them that were, but for the most part, it's just they just don't last that long.
Right. Man, it just goes to show you almost the intent that they took. And, when I say God preserved his word, the fact that the conditions just happen to be perfect, and the amount of copies and the work and all that stuff is really remarkable.
It's amazing. Yeah. So I mean, there are some whole books that have been preserved, like I mentioned. The Book of Isaiah is a famous example. But a lot of times, like the Dead Sea Scrolls they're kind of like a rock band, like they go on tour. And like if you get to see in different sites where they make their stops, you don't usually get to see like an entire scroll. It'll be like it really will be a fragment.
Wow.
But even that fragment is very precious,
Sure.
just because of its rarity.
Yeah, that's amazing. Are there any misconceptions you feel that Christians have about the reliability or the significance of the Hebrew text?
Um,
Any
I
pop
don't
out?
know. I haven't. I don't know about a lot of misconceptions. I think maybe there's um, a lack of familiarity or a sense of
Okay.
foreignness. Naturally, I mean, it's another language, and you're
Right.
doing with a lot of times what basically looks like scraps,
Right. Right.
because that's sometimes what these fragments are. That's kind of fragments are kind of a nicer word, but
Right. Right.
sometimes they really are scraps. But they do have ancient writing on them.
Sure.
Um, yeah, and a lot of times, really most, if not all the time, they confirm the reliability of our translations today. So maybe I can fill in another thing here that might be helpful to your listeners is that for a long time before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the late 40s, not only English translations, but translations of the Bible were based primarily on a Hebrew manuscript from about 1000 AD. And the reason for that is because was the best that we had. And
Sure.
actually, it's still a very good and reliable text because it had been faithfully preserved by a group of Jewish scribes called the Masoretes, and they were very meticulous. And that text is still considered very important and even authoritative, even if not absolutely authoritative today. But you can imagine the kinds of questions that might come up,
Sure.
whether from a Christian or especially a skeptic who might say, okay, well, this complete Old Testament text, that one happens to be complete. They have other texts from that period that aren't. But they're like, okay, they're going to say, okay, this is 1,000 years after the time of Jesus. And the Old Testament's supposedly written before that, right? So, there's a lot of time. There's over a millennia that has elapsed. So how sure are you of the reliability of the scribes? We're
Right.
not all trying to totally, cast out upon them and all that, but can you at least confirm this, right? At least from, just from an honest perspective,
Of course.
um, without being overly critical. And I think what the Dead Sea Scrolls do is that they confirm so much of that, because now all of a sudden you're finding Hebrew manuscripts that are 1,000 years older than that previously what was the oldest Hebrew text of the Bible, and it's very much confirming um, that later text from 1000 AD. And yes, there's some small differences, but the small differences are not enough to make a major impact on translation.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Incredible stuff. So I would definitely going to turn this into talking about the Messianic vision of the Pentateuch, the book that you had wrote. But I want to ask you this because the Old Testament, I believe, gets such a bad rap compared to the New Testament. But I believe that and again, correct me if I'm wrong, so feel free to disagree. But I feel that one of the main, components about this Old Testament scripture that a lot of people that at least I engage with have an issue with is they miss out on the context and the culture and the beauty and like the deeper meaning, the full story of what's trying to be told versus picking out individual verses. And the way we describe it is God dictation versus God breathed. Like so many people take every scripture as a dictation or a prescription. You must do this. And when you're plucking out a particular story or a particular verse, it looks like God is an awful God in regards to how he deals with some people or how he handles some people, versus if you read the whole text in context and see the story, a description of actually what's going on and how God worked through these imperfect humans to still get to this unbelievable, I guess, pinnacle in Jesus Christ. We call it this redemptive arc, from the fall all the way to Christ, and God's breathing on things that maybe are not ideal, but they're kind of pushing you closer to the "it is finished," that final consummation of Jesus Christ. So, any just thoughts on that statement there?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great point. And um, I think before I started doing what I do as a Bible professor, when I was in middle school and high school, I was blessed to have a youth pastor who challenged us to read the whole Bible straight through.
Hmm.
And I think what that did for me is exactly what you're talking about, Pastor Johnny, and that is to give us an idea of the whole story of Scripture, which is actually the whole story of the world and of the universe.
Right.
Genesis 1:1, which we all know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And where does it all end up? Well, he creates a new heavens and new earth. And that's described via a prophecy in Revelation. But that's encompassing all of history. And I think what that did was it sparked in me a love for the Bible in terms of the Old and New Testaments. So it can be, you know, it's good for us, right, to encourage and exhort people over and over again to love the Bible. But then we also need to like apply that and show how that um, works for the Old Testament specifically. What do you do with that?
Right.
But back to my own reading through Scripture, what that really gave me an appreciation of is the build up to the coming of Christ. Relatively speaking, the Old Testament covers a lot more history. The narrative and stories cover a lot more time. And certainly the most important period of time in history so far is the coming of Jesus, the God man, to save all of us.
Right.
But there's a build up to that. And reading the Old Testament and even studying it can help us understand and appreciate who Jesus is. So if he fulfills the covenant with Abraham, what does that mean? Right?
Right.
Well, there's no way you can answer that question without the Old Testament. If he's the son of David, people are calling him son of David. What does that mean?
Right.
What kind of expectations are in there? Maybe what kind of expectations do they have that are maybe a little bit misguided? But
Right.
what are the expectations that are actually there in the Old Testament? And how do all these things work with the fall of the Davidic dynasty when they get exiled to Babylon, and now there's another so-called son of David? How does this fit into the covenant that God made with David? All this stuff, it's coming out of the Old Testament.
Right.
Not to mention creation um, and the fall and the origin of sin and Satan's role in all of this. These are coming so much from the Old Testament. And yes, the New Testament definitely has something to say on these things too. But I think both of them together really enrich our own sense of self identity and understanding of what it means to be a Christian.
Sure. It's like turning a movie on and just watching the last 20 minutes and trying to figure out
Yes.
what happened in the whole storyline
Yes.
before.
It's exactly like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. So let's get into some of these because in your book, The Messianic Vision of the Pentateuch, you argue that Moses intentionally wrote about the Messiah. So how do the manuscripts preserve that vision? And can you give us a couple examples where this messianic thread just stands out clearly to you?
Yeah. Um, to frame this question, and it kind of ties into your earlier question, our discussion as well. One of the things that makes the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, as some prefer to call it, so interesting to me to study is that actually this particular part of the Bible is a highly debated, contested, and controversial text, and it has been for 2,000 years
Sure.
easily. And what I'm getting at is, I'm circling back to your question, is the relationship between the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and Jesus, um, who we believe to be the Messiah.
Sure.
Relatedly, it's the question of the relationship, if any, between the Old Testament and what Christians call the gospel. That's the question that we're wrestling with. And when I describe it in that way, maybe some folks are starting to get an idea as to why it's been so controversial for all this time. And that is because there have been some who read the same text, the same Old Testament, and don't come away with the same meaning. Actually, it happens within Jesus' own lifetime. It happens on the pages of the New Testament. Whether it's Jesus and the Pharisees, they're scholars. They didn't call it the Old Testament, but we could say that they're Old Testament scholars. But actually, there isn't even just one stripe of Jewish interpretation at that time, because we read in the Gospels that the Pharisees and Sadducees disagreed about certain things. And then you got the disciples; they're Jewish. They're Jewish also, but they when they came to understand the Old Testament in a new way, the way that Jesus taught them, they realized, oh, this was about Jesus all along. And even a Jesus who would die and then rise on the third day. So Paul in the synagogues, he's essentially doing the same kind of thing post-resurrection with those that are there. He's trying to persuade them that the scriptures that they study and treasure and cherish so dearly really are about Jesus, the Messiah, who died and rose again on the third day for the sins of the world and to redeem us from death. So that's a little bit of framing.
Yeah, great.
But that whole debate, it reflects on every single book on the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, because the Pentateuch is the book that emphasizes the law of God
Right.
the most, right? There's really no other book that describes the law in detail like that. You get reflections on it and remembrances of it, but if you want the record of the giving of the law, it's there.
Sure.
It's in Exodus, in Leviticus, it's in Deuteronomy. But what just finally circle back to your original question, where do I see, and really not just me, where do I see prophecies of a Messiah in the Pentateuch? I look for them in certain key passages, such as Genesis 3:15. So after the fall, God is pronouncing judgment on the three guilty parties, the serpent, the woman, and Adam. As he pronounces judgment on the serpent, he says that I will put enmity or continued strife between you and the woman, that's Eve, and between your seed and her seed. That is, that this conflict that just happened in the garden where you tricked her and you won, there's going to be a continuation of this conflict in your respective offspring. But it sounds like at a certain point, this conflict will end. The conflict is not forever, because ultimately the next sentence in Genesis 3:15 is that the seed of the woman will crush your head. He's going to crush the snake's head, while at the same time the snake is going to crush the seed of the woman's heel. What makes that passage, this verse, the seed of the woman text, is, like I mentioned earlier, it's controversial, it's debated, and so if we go on and look online or ask, Chat GPT for an interpretation, it may give us one or give us a few options.
Sure.
But let me explain why I think that a messianic interpretation makes sense here.
Okay.
There are a few. I think one of them is that it's when the seed of the woman crushes the serpent's head, it doesn't say that he crushes the serpent's seed's head, even though it had just said that there's going to be enmity between the woman's seed and the serpent's seed. So you might expect that, okay, that means that the woman's seed is going to crush the serpent's seed. I think that's true, but also true. But in the verse itself, it says that the seed of the woman is going to crush the serpent's head. Okay, so somehow that means that the serpent is still going to be around at whatever time that the seed of the woman comes.
Hmm.
And you keep reading Genesis, you keep reading the Pentateuch, and you keep reading the whole Old Testament even. And this seed of the woman has not yet come. And if you had any doubt, you could say, well, does the serpent's head get crushed? I mean, that does not happen in the Old Testament. That much, you're not going to find it anywhere unless there's a prophecy of it. So that would suggest that we're not dealing with some ordinary serpent. And also, if you have some human being, a man, because the seed is a he, they differentiate between he and she in Hebrew pronouns, just like in English. There's going to be a son, and he is going to defeat this serpent. That hints, it doesn't spell it out, but it hints that this guy, he's something special, because if you read to the end of the Old Testament and nobody crushes the serpent's head, that also suggests that nobody could, right?
Mm.
I mean, it's not that obvious, but maybe nobody
Right.
could either. But this guy can. He's special, and at the same time, he also gets wounded, right? His heel gets struck. Well, I mean, the alignment with the coming of Jesus and his death on the cross, I think, is very strong.
Yeah.
And there's also some grammatical issues there in the Hebrew where it says that when it says he will crush your head, it's more likely that he is referring to an individual, just like I've been assuming, rather than saying that just humanity as a whole, like a group, her offspring
Gotcha.
as a whole is going to crush the serpent's head. So I think it's more likely, just on the level of Hebrew language, for that he to refer to an individual son, man.
Gotcha.
So that would be one. But that, and I pull out some others in the book, but that by itself, when you look at the Pentateuch as a whole, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and even the whole Old Testament, it makes a huge difference. So I'm not going to assume that you or all your listeners are immediately convinced, but let's say that some of you already are, or you come to be. What that means is that in the Old Testament, it is already telling us that salvation comes through a suffering Messiah. It is
Mm.
already telling you in Genesis 3. And so, in
Mm.
that sense, it does not matter what other um, supposed hopes of salvation might come later,
Right.
because it already told you right here. So, I think that affects then the way I interpret the giving of the law.
Mm.
So, that's where I'm going with this, because yes, there are many passages related to the law where it's talking about the consequences, right? If you obey, you get blessed; you disobey, you get cursed.
Sure.
But wait, what about Genesis 3:15? It already said that there's going to be a seed of the woman that's going to crush the head of the snake.
Right.
What that means is that even though Exodus through Leviticus is so law focused, at least from Exodus 20 on, the defeat of the serpent is still going to come through the seed of the woman. It
Right.
doesn't have, in Genesis 3:15, it doesn't have anything to do with the law. There's no
Right.
mention of the giving of the law. So that's not saying the law is not important. It doesn't have its uses. It does. It reveals the character of God, all kinds of things. But
Sure.
as far as what the Pentateuch is saying, and even what the Old Testament means from its third chapter, the impact is major. So that's also why, to circle back from a different perspective, why I think that passage is so debated. Because if you, depending on how you decide this one,
Right.
there's a massive domino effect
Yeah.
on how you're going to read everything else in the Old Testament, and then how you're going to relate the Old and the New Testament. But I think there's other passages in the Pentateuch that reinforce and fill out this original messianic prophecy in Genesis 3:15. But I'll pause there in case you want to.
No. So I do want to continue that, but I just did want to say that we have all of Dr. Chen's works linked in the description below over here. So if you want to check out some of his books, please do so. We know that you will be blessed by his work. So, I mean, I was going to ask you, kind of hit on it, like what even would be the opposite view of why, like what else could it be? Like what else could that be referencing there that
Yeah,
people
well,
say?
there's been quite a few of different interpretations, and I want to be respectful of them, because I mean, there are established positions out there with people that believe in them even strongly. And I'm not even sure that I would say that the position I'm taking is necessarily a majority view, but I don't know if there is a majority view among the multiple views out there. So this is one
Right.
of those verses where if you punt, then you just end up with nothing because there isn't a majority. There may not necessarily be a majority view.
Gotcha.
But I think for passages, it's a lot of times the controversial verses in the Old Testament are the messianic ones. So if you let go of those, you end up with a weaker connection between Christ and the Old Testament. So
Right, right.
that's what I'm out here doing, sometimes in a more academic way, but it doesn't always have to be like that. But to answer your question directly, uh, there were some that would say, okay, maybe this is just has to do with human beings and snakes. And this is why a lot of people don't like snakes. And that would be one reason. I don't think that one is that popular a view, but it's been put out there.
I mean,
Another one,
that's a little bit of a like a placebo effect too. If all you'd
right?
be doing is being taught that, snakes are bad, snakes are bad, snakes are bad. I mean, I've seen this type of thing, this thinking go to levels where, something like people are scared of pumpkins as well too, because it's referencing Halloween. Yet, pumpkin pie is pretty good. I like it, anyways.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you
It
get it in
doesn't.
your head.
It's an interpretation that ultimately results in that verse sort of falling flat and not having much of a purpose. Another more common one is to see the seed of the woman as humanity in general,
Okay.
and um, and that is instead of seeing it as an individual. And so that would be taken in such a direction as, okay, well, the seed of the woman, because the word seed, it can refer to a group, just like the word offspring or seed in English can. So we're talking about the Hebrew word zera, and like seed and offspring in English, seed can be one seed, like a plant seed or whatever, or it can be a whole bag of seed, right? We could say
Right,
things
right,
like
right.
that. Or I could say, like, I have two kids, right? But if I only had one, I could say my offspring and refer to one of them. But if you have more than one kid, you can still say they're your offspring.
Right, right,
So
right.
the word in Hebrew zera that's translated seed or offspring in Genesis 3:15 is like that. So
Mm,
there is room within the Hebrew word itself for it to refer to a group, and there are examples in the Old Testament where it does refer to a group. So the rub is, okay, are there ever any instances where it refers to an individual? And how do you tell? And so that
right.
gets into some Hebrew language and grammar that you guys can check out in the book if you're interested in. But just to give you a brief summary, if there is a pronoun that refers back to that seed and that pronoun is singular and plural or plural, by and large, that singular or plural of the pronoun matches whether the seed itself refers to a singular or plural seed. So
Interesting.
if it said there's going to be enmity between your seed and her seed, they will crush your head, then it's more likely that the seed of the woman is plural because it said they will crush your head. But because it says
Right.
he will crush your head, it's more likely that it's
An individual.
individual. So,
Gotcha.
yeah, those are a few ways that people look at it. And then there's kind of a both and. This is sort of a mediating position where um, some would take the seed of the woman as a group that is humanity, but ultimately there's still one person that comes out of that, the Messiah who crushes the head of the snake and gets wounded. For me, I just think there's a closer fit if you take it as a singular all the way through, because it's not humanity as a whole or even Christians as a whole that crush the head of Satan directly, much less have our heels struck by him. Rather, it's an individual who crushes the snake's head and who has his heel struck. And we participate in his victory in an
Mm,
indirect way. We don't gain that victory directly ourselves.
correct. Right. Right. Also, I want to get into something I keep hearing you reference as the nexus passages in a second here,
Sure.
but I think I heard a podcast that you did yesterday that you brought up this aspect of, just if you could share a little bit on it, and that's more along the lines of the structure of the Hebrew narrative, specifically in regards to the importance of repetition. How does that shape interpretation in general? Like
Yeah.
when you see things keep just being repeated over and
Yeah.
how it's being repeated.
Yeah. Um, Repetition in the Bible is one of the most important ways that a biblical author can signal to us as readers what is important.
Hmm.
Um, in contrast, like when we have a verbal dialogue like we're having now, we can vary the volume of our voice. We can vary the speed with which we talk. We
Right.
can vary um, we can vary the tone of our voice. There's a lot of different kinds of tools that we can use to emphasize things. And we can also clarify things. Like if you ask me a question or I ask you for a question or there's some kind of comment and we follow up, we can
Oh,
use
good.
those kinds of tools to communicate effectively in live dialogue. When it comes to a written text, it's different. So we're still using the same language, but it's
Right,
not a
right.
dialogue anymore. And there's no volume, there's no pacing, there's no tone, at least in the tone of voice. So what then does an author have at his or her disposal? One of those things, one of the most important things, is repetition.
Hmm.
So that's going to tie into something you also mentioned in your question, my more recent book about nexus passages. And
Yes, yes. Let's get into
what
that.
those, I coined the term, by the way, but it's not, it's a new term for something that people have already recognized in the Bible. And that is
Okay.
that some passages in the Bible have a lot of connections to other passages. They have more connections to other passages in the Bible than just your average passage. So if you pick any verse at random out of scripture, it's going to have connections to the verse before and the verse after. That's just a given. That's the immediate context. But there are some passages that they're not only going to connect to their immediate context, the section that they're in, maybe even the previous chapter and the next chapter, but these nexus passages are going to they're going to connect even more and connect even further.
Hmm.
The way in which they connect and the way you discern these connections is through repetition. So you look first and foremost for repeated words. Although that's not the only criteria, it's the most, it's the strongest criteria, the strongest kind of evidence. So to go back to Genesis 3:15, it uses the word seed. Now, I think even a casual reader of the book of Genesis, if you were to pay attention to the word seed in Genesis, you'll actually notice that it keeps popping up. So, for example, when God calls Abraham in Genesis 12, he says, right, leave your family, right, go to the land I'll show you. And then a few verses down in verse 7, he says, and to your seed I will give this land. Then a few
Hmm.
chapters later, it's been over 10 years, still no promised son or seed. And it's Genesis 15, and Abraham is wondering, Lord, where is my son, the son that you said you would give me? And in that dialogue where the Lord reassures Abram in a vision, he says, I will give you a seed. So that's a form of repetition, and it's going to continue throughout the Abrahamic story.
Hmm.
You
Sure.
can connect that with the promised seed from Genesis 3:15. There's this repetition, or you might say a theme of seed that's running like a thread through this book. So that's how repetition works. And in Nexus passages, it's going to have multiple terms that are repeated from other passages. Um, it could be, I'm just thinking of one off the top of my head that I talk about in the newer book. Um, in Numbers 24, where there's another important messianic prophecy, verse 17, of a star of Jacob and a scepter that's going to rise from Israel. I mean, on the one hand, that gives us a beautiful image. There's a star, there's a scepter, but at the same time, those words, star and scepter, can be traced back to the Abrahamic promises. How?
Hmm.
Well, because when God promises Abraham numerous offspring, he does it in multiple ways. He says, great nation. He says they'll be numerous like this dust of the earth, like the sand on the seashore, and like the stars in the heavens. And so there in Numbers 24:17, it's the prophecy, it's a prophecy of one star who's going to come out of Jacob. Now, Jacob,
Hmm.
in a sense, is many stars, right? Because Abraham's descendants, in a sense, are many or will be many stars, but there's also going to be one star, the star of Jacob. Likewise, scepter, comes from yet another important messianic prophecy in Genesis 49, where Jacob is blessing his sons one by one. They're going to become the future tribes of Israel. And to Judah, he says, the scepter will not depart from Judah. In other words, Judah is going to be the royal tribe. They are going to be the ones from whom kings come. And of course, David and the house of David comes from there. Even before David comes, in Numbers 24:17, it says that this star of Jacob is also a scepter from Israel.
Right.
So that's repetition. And number 24, I'm also treating as a nexus passage because it's got those connections and even more to previous passages in the Pentateuch, especially that concern the Messiah and the Abrahamic covenant promises.
Gotcha. Man, you guys got to check out this book and connect with Dr. Chen, because I listen. I did stalk you on Facebook a little bit, Dr. Chen, just to check you out, and watching all the YouTube videos and listening to all the podcasts.
Thanks.
And I ordered a couple of the books, and it was just fascinating to me. So I thank you for your work. I know we have a bit of a time limit today, but I have one more question, I guess, would be
Sure.
for you in regards to, I guess for the listeners, what are some good first steps for Christians who want to engage deeper with the Hebrew Bible or manuscript traditions? Like, how would somebody even get started in understanding these verses a little bit more in depth?
Let's see. I can think of a couple ways. One is harder. And that would be to start learning Hebrew.
Okay.
Slow. It's a long process, but there might be a small contingent of your listeners that
It might be.
that for which that might be an encouragement. It can be done, and if you feel the motivation and you have space in your life, it's worth it. That would be one way. I think another way would be to consult books that are using Hebrew and explaining it in a way that an English reader can understand. And maybe you can at least learn some key words in Hebrew related to whatever you're interested in, whether you're interested in seed. I mean, it's not too hard to learn one Hebrew word, zera.
Right.
And you can even learn how the Hebrew letters look so that when it comes up in some book or something, it won't throw you off. You know how it looks, and you can learn about it in that way. But there's resources out there. Sometimes there can be some material online or some courses and things like that can help. I'd recommend, if you're interested in the Messiah, there are other authors that write on the topic, whether my former teacher and doctoral advisor, Dr. John Sailhamer, Sailhamer. And there's others that you could find.
Great. Wonderful. This was fun, Dr. Chen. I appreciate it very much. Again, taking the time out today. How can people get a hold of you? Are you on social media at all? Is there a way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah. I'm on Facebook, so you could look me up there. Just look up Kevin Chen. There might be more than one person with that name. But another way is also to look up my faculty page at Gateway Seminary. Gateway Seminary's website is gs.edu, and you could Google it and just add my name on there. I can also just tell you guys my email address. It's Kevin Chen, KEVINCHEN @gs.edu.
Now, any projects coming up? You got anything coming up for the summer and into the fall and winter?
Yeah, I'm always working on something, and I'm actually done with the next project, but I'm looking forward to it coming out. I've written a Daniel commentary.
Oh, wow.
And so that should be coming out later this year, Lord willing. It'll be published through Langham. It's an international Christian publisher focused on the global church, and is part of a commentary series called Asia Bible Commentary.
Wow. Well, maybe we'll get you on again. That'd be awesome to talk about that once that's closer to coming out, if you have some time.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. No, my pleasure. Well, again, Dr. Chen, thank you for your time today. I know you are busy, but I know the audience is going to be blessed by our conversation today. I had a lot of fun chatting with you.
Thank you so much, Pastor Johnny. It's been fun, and I hope it's been helpful to all of you listeners out there.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.